introducing Dr. Robert Kinscherf for today's CLE presentation. Just a few housekeeping notes before we get started. For those who are in the room, please make sure you sign in. You probably saw the sign-in sheets on your way in. I saw a lot of folks doing that. But if not, please make sure you do that before you leave. For those online, please sign in using the link in the chat. Please also keep your camera off and microphone muted. And then we have applied for 1.5 standard CLE credits, and those are pending. So the code for today's presentation is 540122. So with those housekeeping items out of the way, we are so incredibly grateful to have Dr. Robert Kinscherf here with us today to talk about the science of adolescence and emerging adulthood and what it means for prosecution practice. I'm going to read Dr. Kinscherf's biography for you because I cannot possibly remember it. Dr. Kinscherf is a clinical forensic psychologist and attorney serving as executive director of the Center for Law, Brain, and Behavior at Massachusetts General Hospital, which is the flagship teaching hospital of Harvard Medical School. He is also a professor at the Doctoral Clinical Psychology program at William James College, where he teaches courses in forensic psychology and law. Dr. Kinscherf is a fellow of the American Psychological Association and has held leadership positions in government and clinical care systems, including previously serving as director of juvenile court clinic services for the Massachusetts Trial Court, overseeing a statewide system of juvenile court clinics, assistant commissioner for forensic mental health for the Massachusetts Department of Mental Health, overseeing community-based and facilities-based forensic mental health services and training, and forensic examiner for the Massachusetts Parole Board. His practice and research areas include juvenile and emerging young adult justice issues, violence, risk assessment and management, juvenile homicide, youthful and adult violent offenders with mental disorders, ethics and law in forensic behavioral health practice, and developmental interactions of adversity, trauma, and resilience. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Kinscherf. One last housekeeping note is that Dr. Kinscherf is hoping for questions throughout. I will be walking around with a microphone and hope that you will engage with us. Thank you.
Thank you. And my thanks to the Office of the Hennepin County Attorney for giving me this opportunity. Also had a wonderful conversation last night. And I would like this to be as conversational as possible. There's a lot to cover, but there's also a lot to say, especially about how we think about applying some of this work into actual practice. And I think what I am most eager to convey is that this is one of those areas where a science-informed approach, an evidence-informed approach can actually work to buttress two goals, sometimes thought of as being in opposition, but actually the research would suggest and the practice in many of our states and many of our peer countries would suggest that community safety and the individual well-being of people who come into the criminal and juvenile justice systems are not in opposition. In fact, over time, they are aligned. And we'll talk about why that might be and why we might want to think about this through a lens that's also historical in that while the United States, with about 5% of the world's population, has the world's largest carceral population, that's not always been the tradition in the United States. The tradition of incarceration as the primary mode of accountability did not really exist in that way, certainly before the time when prisons were prevalent. And well into the 20th century, we had one of the lowest rates of incarceration amongst the developed nations in the world. And then in the mid-20th century, something happened, and like all human beings, we habituate to the familiar. It becomes the new normal. We never lived in the past part, and so we think this is the way that the world has always worked, and it hasn't. And we sometimes stifle our opportunities to sort of say, well, where are we now? I'm a big believer in just looking at what the data says. I have a colleague who was a combat pilot and often uses the metaphor of flying blind. If you don't have good information coming into your systems, then you're flying blind and often just making stuff up because it's familiar rather than because it's the most effective way of doing business. So I also want to state at the outset, because of my institutional affiliations and where I live now, most people assume that I'm somehow implicitly a carceral abolitionist, and I'm not. Not a carceral abolitionist. And I do believe that there are people for whom being out of the community is a necessary step. The question is, a necessary step for what, and what we do with them while they're out of the communities. And we actually have some data about what we want to do with people in the process of incarcerating them and then during their terms of incarceration that will reduce the likelihood that they will come back into contact with the system. And unfortunately, the world is constructed that for somebody to come back into the system, they typically have to commit another crime, often another crime against the person. So if we can reduce recidivism, although that's not the only metric to pay attention to, we can probably get better outcomes over time for communities. So again, we'll sort of look at the data that. So this is not a trick question. How many of you at one point were adolescents and young adults? Don't bother raising your hands. It's just intended to be sort of a reminder before I ask you the next question. How many of you had somebody in your own family or your own peer group who somewhere between the ages of 15 and 25 made a phenomenally stupid decision that you personally knew?
Oh, I hear you at all. Okay.
This is maybe a little closer to home. Don't feel obligated to raise your hand, but I will tell you this. If you raise your hand, I will not call on you and ask you what it was. How many of you, somewhere between the ages of 15 and 25, made a decision that could have been really quite consequential and would never do it again? Okay, that's wonderful. In a room this big, about 30% of you raised your hands. I can only say that you are a group that have either prepared to engage in self-protective deception or have lived remarkably boring lives. When you ask people that in anonymous surveys in the United States, you get close to 93% of adults will say that they, on at least one occasion in their adolescent or young adulthood, made a decision that in retrospect they would never make again as an adult. Some of them relatively inconsequential, but they never do it again. Others more consequential. I've had the privilege over the past few years of going around the country when I do day-long exercises and workshops and so forth, where there will be breaks. I often invite people to do the following. Outside of the room where we're meeting, in a hallway that's some distance away, I will put up a sheet of paper that begins at 13, and then there's one sheet of paper for each number between 13 and 23. And in their packets, there are little yellow stickies, and I invite people at some point to anonymously leave the room and to go write down something that they did as an adolescent or a young adult and put it under the year of their age as they stick it onto the wall, and then we collect them and sort of run through them. Now, mind you, these are, for the most part, justice system professionals. These are police officers, probation officers, parole officers, judges, defense attorneys, prosecuting attorneys. And when people can acknowledge what they have done in a safe and anonymous way, it is really quite remarkable. Amongst the things that I have gotten back from these professional justice system involved individuals range from, I shoplifted. Okay, I'll give you a pass on that. You're not one person crime with. When I was 14, I ran away with my 19-year-old boyfriend, and we went to the transit authority in New York City and had no money and no place to stay. Poor planning, I'll grant you that. I've had people say, when I was 16, I participated as a lookout when my 22-year-old cousin used a pistol to rob a convenience store. We never got caught. One of my favorites was when I was in high school, and again, well, when I was in high school, I was president of the student body. I got elected partly because I was also the LSD distributor in the high school. Had fairly more organized fan base than most because they showed up to vote. One of them, when I was a freshman in college, I was on one of the sports teams and at a fraternity party, participated in the sexual assault of a sorority sister. She never made a report. We never got caught. I've never been more ashamed of anything else I did in my life. Now, these are people who are now holding very responsible positions in the system amongst us and seem to have been able to figure out their lives in a way that did not continue to harm their communities. In fact, many of them who I've gotten to know subsequently to this have made substantial contributions. Hello? Oh, sorry, I thought I heard somebody wanting my attention. So all of this just to say that decisions that we make in adolescence and young adulthood can be consequential, and sometimes potential consequences play out, and sometimes they don't. Some of us are lucky. I will raise my hand. I did some things between the ages of 15 and 25, mostly with my slightly older cousins, that I'm just very lucky that I didn't see some of you or your colleagues of that time period in their professional capacities. And I've tried my best since that time not to be a plague to my community. But sort of worth thinking about, Brian Stevenson said something a while back that I actually like, which is we are not the worst thing that we've ever done. Essentially, that's his observation. And I'd like to sort of think about that. I also want to say something that just get it out of the way, which is I also engage a lot with the victims of crime in the course of my career. And I understand the magnitude of the impact on communities and on individuals. I have been in dozens of parole hearings where I've listened to the enduring harm and still, sometimes decades later, resonating pain of people who are people who still miss and love the people who were killed by the people who are now up for parole. So I want you to know that I understand the importance of what we're talking about and its consequences for all the people involved. So with that, we'll sort of jump in. We'll be talking mostly through the lens of prosecution and sentencing, because that's where a lot of the policy conversation has been going on, especially since Roper v. Simmons in 2005, which I'm sure most of you know is the decision in 2005 where the U.S. Supreme Court took the execution of persons for committing crimes, capital crimes under the age of 18 off the table. At the time that the United States decided that the execution of persons for crimes committed under the age of 18 was unconstitutional, we were one of two countries that still officially allowed for the execution of minors under judicial fiat through a legal process system. Now, I recognize there are a lot of countries where if an adolescent or a young adult gets too annoying, they are simply shot in the back of the head by the police who police their communities. They skip the niceties of charges and trial. And I also know that there are places where a lot of things go on that are outside. They're in the shadow of the legal fiat. So I'm not a Pollyanna about this. But there were only two countries in the world. One of them was Sudan. The other one was Somalia. Both of them at the time were embroiled in civil wars where juvenile and young adult justice reform was way down their list of priorities. But the United States was very late to the table in the world on the execution of children. And then we've seen other cases, largely around sentencing, which we'll reference. But I don't want us to think that this is all just about sentencing, because we also know that adolescence and young adulthood also shapes their encounters with police at street level. That can shape the arrest decision, the charging decisions, all kinds of stuff. We also know that youthfulness can shape the way in which young people respond in Miranda situations. And 2011 in JBD versus North Carolina, the Supreme Court for the first time explicitly indicated that age was a consideration to be taken into account when understanding the voluntariness of a Miranda confession. It is of interest to me that in some of our partner countries, our peer countries, United Kingdom and parts of Canada, for example, police officers are not permitted to have custodial interrogations of minors and a couple of other groups without both audio and videotaping the entire thing from beginning to end and preserving that. And they also are not permitted to do the interrogation until they've had at least a year of specialized training and supervised practice. They use the interrogation tapes as training methods for them. The reason for that is because of the very high rate of false confessions offered by adolescents and early young adults who simply believe that if they give the police officers something, they will let them go home, which is sometimes not entirely irrational, since police in the United States are permitted to tell people, if you'll just help me out, I can't promise you anything, but I'll help you out, and you'll go home. I've seen some really quite remarkably blundered, from a developmental point of view, police interrogations involving very serious crimes, alleged very serious crimes, where they are textbook examples how not to interrogate a young person. So we want to be thinking about how their youthfulness may shape that point, which is a very important point. In a room full of prosecutors, you know that having a confession is a very powerful instrument in a prosecution. What the research tells us is that juries will often accept confessions even when the confession absolutely is contradicted by ample physical and other evidence. It's a very important moment in that trajectory. We also want to be thinking about theories of joint venture, transferred intent, felony murder. Get into those a little bit more, but they are certainly questionable doctrines for younger persons in the presumption that when they do something with someone else, that they are sharing the goal of that enterprise. Competence-related capacities, especially plea bargain. You all know that most cases are resolved short of full trial. Most cases are resolved by plea bargain. And there is ample evidence for the proposition that they often do not entirely appreciate the process of plea bargaining and the consequences of plea bargaining. And that can also be shaped by the conduct of defense counsel, who are sometimes more or less vigorous in making sure that their client, the person that they're representing, is fully aware of what will be happening as a result of the bargain. Also shaped by things like their sense of time, their sense of loyalty to their peers, especially if they are co-defendants. All kinds of things complicate. Pre-trial and post-conviction conviction conditions. Those can often play a role in the likelihood of violation. And at least in my world, it's quite clear, and a lot of the research would say that most of the time when you have violations of conditions, they're the standard and technical violations of telling a juvenile you need to go to school. A juvenile has been truant for the past 117 days, and all of a sudden he's flawlessly go to school. And what we saw in our system, that was we were just kind of getting kids deeper and deeper and deeper into the system for things that did not involve new offenses, but were violations of standards. Finally, I think we need to think about the conditions of confinement, especially the still quite prevalent use of solitary confinement. I don't know what the use of solitary confinement is in Minnesota, but I know it continues to be quite widely used nationally. We put some fairly sharp restrictions on it now in Massachusetts, but that's only been within the past couple of years. We have learned through neuroscience that when persons are in confinement, solitary confinement, especially young people or even adults, if it is prolonged solitary confinement, that it results not only in psychological injury, but there's a brain basis for what we observe as psychological injury. There was a case recently heard in the First District Federal Court by a federal judge in Rhode Island who basically looked at the case of a gentleman who was in prolonged solitary confinement because he had possessed Suboxone in a Rhode Island state prison, and they had put him into solitary confinement for a period that went over a decade. And there had been a statutory provision in law that prevented civil suits against correctional authorities or others for psychological injuries. You had to prove physical injury. Neuroscience brief was submitted, neuroscience testimony was taken. Federal judge determined that when we're watching the psychological injuries, which you've known about for 50, 60 years of prolonged solitary confinement, what we're watching is the reflection of brain injuries. And so he basically said, for these purposes going forward, qualified immunity will not apply, because now you are on notice that when you put people in these conditions, you are also physically injuring them as well. Unfortunately, what the research also tells us is that after a certain point, people do not recover from those physical brain injuries, become permanent injuries. And weirdly enough, one of the parts of the brain that atrophies when you are in prolonged solitary confinement is the part of your brain that allows you to make social appraisals. You know how your brain, when you walk into, like, can you read the room? You read the tone, the interaction between you and another person. That part of the brain atrophies, and after it's gone for a certain point, they can never re-engage in the same way. They can't read a room, they can't read people, so they tend to then self-isolate because they don't know what's going on in the social context around. So brain science sort of offers us kind of a neutral road. I loved the way in which the Roper v. Simmons case, for example, moved away from, I think of it as a death spiral rhetoric of, are you hard on crime or are you soft on crime? They basically turned to the brain science and said, and developmental science said, we know that children are different, and they use that science to braid constitutional doctrine about the death penalty with the understanding that adolescents, in particular, up to age 18 in Roper, but now we have the science to say it goes a little bit further than that, that youth are different. Children and youth are different. And so we need to take that into account as we frame our jurisprudence. So if our policy and practice goals are either community safety and or the positive young adult development and adolescent development of the people who become court involved, the good thing about that is they need not be in conflict with each other. And in fact, one of the things that we see pretty clearly from the research is that systems that have the most aggressively prosecutorial responses to youth crime, and here I'm talking adolescents and early young adults up to about 20, 21, and the harshest responses to those crimes actually have the highest recidivism rates. So if the goal is community safety and harsh punishment actually yields greater recidivism, over time it actually compromises public safety rather than supports public safety. So I'm not interested anymore in the rhetoric on soft on crime or hard on crime. I'm much more interested in what actually works here. What's smart on crime? And I note that in these turbulent and polarized political times, the one omnibus bill that was bipartisan and got out of Congress in the first Trump administration was a Criminal Justice Reform Act, which began to incorporate a lot of the sciences step. So even in a polarized world of very, very different points of view, politically and socially, most people can see that following the data is really a good start for almost all of us. So what I'm going to show you is really interesting because I'm not showing you the data from justice-involved youth. This is normative adolescence. This is what we know from simply looking at the social and brain development of young people as they make this transition from being children into being early young adults. So it's not just that they spike in crime, they do. They also have more car crashes, even when you practice even if you control for the practice effect. Parents have known this for years before this data was collected. Insurance companies have certainly known it. And that's one of the reasons why in many states now, even when you can get your license at age 16, you're not allowed to drive alone without an adult with a peer until you're 17 or 18. You have more car crashes. It's just some data. As for the injuries and deaths associated with car crashes, I'm now entering a high risk period. I'm now over 70, so watch out for me, folks. I wasn't terrific at 16, and I'm not getting any better now. They were more likely to have unintended pregnancies. Now here I want you to start looking at the curves. We were there in the auto, but I don't want to go back. So unintended pregnancies spiking in late adolescence, early 20s, and then dropping. Attempting suicide, non-fatal and non-fatal self-inflicted injuries, look at the rocket that goes off with the onset of puberty, peaking again in late adolescence and then coming down as they enter their early to mid-20s. More likely to begin experimenting with substances and develop patterns of substance use and addiction. And there you can see the same thing, prevalence of drug use by age group spiking at between about 18, 19, 20, and then sharply dropping about 23, 24. In fact, what we know now from the neuroscience of addiction is that if you don't begin using substances or significant pattern of substance use by the time you're 23 or 24, the odds that you will ever become addicted to a substance or even a heavy user of a substance goes down with each passing year. The alcohol and tobacco people have known this for years, and now the cannabis people know it, which is one of the reasons why they have worked so very hard to try and get as many as young people consuming their substances before they turn 20. Because they're trying to create lifelong consumers, and they know that's the sweet spot, that's the window. And one of the reasons why we're here, perhaps the reason, they commit more crimes. So you see a spike of arrests starting in the late teens and then beginning to drop off. We call this the age crime curve. Many of you are familiar with the age crime curve. Some of you? Okay. We've known about the age crime curve since the 1830s, so this is not exactly a closely held national security secret. It has been replicated dozens and dozens and dozens of times, and not just in the United States. In every country in which the studies have been done, which includes European countries, Asian countries, some African, Middle Eastern countries, youthful misconduct, including illegal conduct, spikes and then comes down. Now, what's interesting about this is that it comes down not as the result of an officially imposed sanction. It comes down because their brains are turning on, and we'll see how that's working. And also they're going into adult identities and adult lives where continued criminal activity simply becomes incompatible with who they want to be and the kind of life that they want to live. We've known since early 1960s at the latest, and it's been replicated again over and over and over again, is that this age crime curve is a thing. It occurs for both genders. It occurs across all ethnic groups, religious groups, and the like. This is just showing you that whether we're talking about homicide or drug drug violations or other kinds of violations, we see the same rough shape of this curve. So I'm showing you this only to show you that it's not just crime that spikes and comes down. Track that with unintended pregnancy. Track that with they drown more often. Track that with more automobile accidents. Something is going on that is not just in the criminal lane. It's a general phenomenon of youth. And we see the peak ages for everything from property crimes to homicide peaking at roughly the same ages and then dropping. And it stayed pretty steady over time. Violent crimes actually drop off more rapidly than do non-violent crimes, property and drug possession. You see that drop off over time as well. We see also that there is not an obvious and intuitive relationship between severity of consequence, if the consequence is defined as incarceration, and the likelihood of recidivism. Some years ago, there was a revision in sentencing practices of the federal courts that basically dropped the guideline for sentencing by about 2 years for certain drug possession crimes. And you would think that when these folks got dropped off 2 years, that they would be more likely to recidivate because they were getting less time incarcerated. It turns out the people who had the shorter sentences actually had lower recidivism rates than people who had the additional 2 years tacked on. This is one of the natural experiments. Nobody sort of planned that. This was an unanticipated consequence. At least it was to people in the United States, although the people in the European countries have known that shorter bursts of incarceration, especially if it is used as a tool of incapacitation rather than punishment, and then attention to the conditions of confinement brings their recidivism rates be much lower than ours. Some of them have fashioned this into their policies for quite some time. And so in 1947, the United States had a model code that was going to go before the US Congress. We never passed it here. There was a great deal of opposition to changes in our system at that time. But it was picked up by the war-torn countries of Europe, and they took it seriously. I know that as Americans, culturally, we sort of are suspicious of what people in other countries do, especially if it's French, damn it. But here, I think we can sort of say, well, they took it from us, so maybe we should think about taking it back. And their system is a tripartite system: juvenile court to age 18, young adult system with its own system of courts, its own rules of evidence and so forth, 18 to 26, and then adult prosecution and incarceration starting at age 27. So no matter what you do in Germany, for example, you will not be incarcerated with persons 27 and older if you are younger than, if you're 26 and younger. But what's interesting is they don't think about it as, they don't think about it so much as a punitive response. They think of it as a restorative response, a correctional response. It's a little ironic. We also like to call our carceral system things like Department of Corrections. But what they do in these relatively short periods of incarceration, remembering that even for youthful homicide, their average sentence on a youthful homicide is 8 years. Much, much shorter than what we routinely people do. What's interesting is what they do with them. Their prisons could be mistaken if you just drove by them as junior college campuses with fencing around them. The fencing is not the mammoth walls that we like to build. It's basically chain link fencing. Their efforts at escape, by the way, are minimal. And it's basically focused heavily on literacy, pre-vocational training, and acculturation. So literacy makes sense. Many of the people who they incarcerate as young people, like ours, are well behind in reading levels. we could take notice of the fact that one of the most robust predictors of whether or not you are going to come back into a state prison system is whether or not you can read at an 8th grade level on the day you return back to your community. The average reading level in a state prisoner in the United States is 4th grade. Do very little by way of intensive literacy education. So they want to make them literate. They also want to prepare them not just to be employable. They want to prepare them to have skilled jobs that will allow them to participate meaningfully in the German working class or even the middle class. So they're not hoping to let them work in the prison kitchen for a while so that they can spend the rest of their adult life day after day, hour after hour, where the most meaningful thing they will say in their life is, do you want to supersize that? They want to get them into BMW plants. They want to get them into their tech industry. They are looking to get them. And when you are halfway through your sentence, they go back to what they do for German students in high school. You go out during the day, you work in your apprentice site, and you come back. And towards the end of your sentence, you're out in the community except coming back for weekends. And then because I think you need to be living in the community that you're going to be returning to if you're going to successfully re-enter and make that as unproblematic as possible. Now, I've heard a lot of people say, well, yes, that their cultures are very different. We're a very heterogeneous culture. They're a very homogeneous culture. They don't face the cultural issues that we do. That's just flatly wrong. If any of you have traveled in Europe recently, they are really quite heterogeneous communities. In fact, I was not surprised to learn, but it made sense. I'd been traveling to do some work in Munich. And while I was there, I learned that more than half of the people who currently live in Munich, Germany, are 3 generations away from being Turkish or within 10 years, refugee arrivals. So they spend a lot of time in acculturation, teaching people German, teaching people who are not from German cultures how you live in Germany, how the rules work there. We do almost none of that in American prisons. Youth arrests for violent crime have dropped pretty substantially in the past 20 years. We did have a spike in some cities during and shortly after COVID. If we have some time at the end, I'd love to have a conversation with you about why some cities had spikes in homicides in the COVID era and why some cities did not, because I think there's some really interesting answers to that. But if you look the comparison between now and where we were in the late 1980s and early 1990s, one could even ask the question, have we flattened the curve on violent crime? And if so, how has that happened? Why is that? Well, the research would tell us that there's no or little impact on youth crime of severity of punishment. We'll see later that what matters is consistency of punishment and certainty or confidence that some accountability will occur. It's sort of routine to make the argument from a policy point of view that we need to incarcerate for long periods of time in order to generate general deterrence. But there's not much, and if I were feeling less charitable, I'd say not a shred of evidence for the proposition that severity of sentence actually has a general deterrent effect on adolescent and young adult crime. If it did, you would expect to see that deterrence effect in those jurisdictions where they have the most aggressive approaches and the most severe penalties. But those actually are the states that have the highest continuing rate of violent youth crime. And so it apparently doesn't have the theoretical effect. In order to get specific deterrence, you don't need to put somebody into prison for 30 years. And usually get, if you're running your system, you can get the specific deterrent effect in 1 to 3 to 5 years, as the Germans have found, the English have found, the Canadians have found, all these other countries who would rather invest the resources not in maintaining somebody for long periods of time, but trying to give them the tools to live safely in their community. There is some fluctuation due to the economy, but not nearly as much as one might surmise. What seems to be the most consistent impact on flattening this curve is consistent access to positive youth development assets. That is, can youth who are sort of at the edges and who are being impacted by social determinants, can they get access to the kinds of resources that most youth will have and will avail themselves of in order to stay on that positive young adult development trajectory. Research is also pretty consistent that the most important one is consistent access to a caring, positive adult will stick with them, mentor them, coach them. And if it's not a parent, is there somebody else in their life? We've all seen families where the parents were either unwilling or unable to perform that function for their kids. There was somebody else. There was a grandmother. There was an uncle. There was an older brother. There was a youth pastor. There was somebody who sticks with the kid over time. That's pretty robust finding. I'm sure some of you in this room, and I had the opportunity to have the chief probation officer in a meeting yesterday. He recognized this phenomenon of kids who are on long-term probation for serious crime, either instead of juvenile incarceration or upon return from juvenile incarceration or jurisdiction, where they come and find me when I worked in the court clinics, and I would have kids look at me and say, so what is the least serious thing I can do to stay on probation and still have my own same probation officer? Because they'd been on probation for 8 months, 12 months, 14 months, sometimes even longer. And the probation officer was the most meaningful person in that kid's life. And the kid knew that. And they knew they would be in deeper water if they didn't have that. Unfortunately, the system that we have now, if they have behavioral health needs, they tend to get served in institutions or facilities, clinics that have very high clinician turnover. They tend to be educated in schools where they have very high turnover amongst teaching staff and the like. So we need to be thinking about how do we get these kids connected with adults in a meaningful way. And it's a concern to me that just before COVID, I don't know if they've replicated it since, the Search Institute did a very large survey nationally of adolescents and young adults in the United States. And 40% of them, 40% said that they could not identify in their own lives one consistent adult who was positive and who cared for them, respected them, and would stick with them even when they made mistakes. 3%. So when we have a young person in a courtroom, we have a young person there to hold them accountable for alleged misconduct. And we're really sort of working on a individual level of analysis, trying to understand what they did and why they did it. That is a piece of the puzzle, but it does not always take into account the social determinants of the environment in which they are developing. And one of the things we know from the brain science is adolescent brains are geared up to all human brains, actually, not just theirs, but theirs in this particularly rapid process of development. Their brains are uniquely wired to adapt to the environment in which the brain finds itself. So, and that's at a really kind of micro level. That's why you can have identical twins who are genetically identically the same, but may have very different ways of operating in the world. Because although they are genetically the same, down to the fine level cell structure, they don't have every single same daily experience, day after day, hour after hour, year after year. Their hardware, if you will, their brain circuitry is being shaped by the specific experiences that they as individuals have. What I found fascinating about this is I was actually working with a colleague, not on youth in particular, but we were looking at social determinants of health, and we were trying to see whether or not a public health model actually made any sense when you were looking at gun violence. So we started off by looking what the public health models are. What are the social determinants of how healthy you're going to be, how long you're going to stay healthy, and what your lifespan is going to be. More exposure you have to these kinds of negative social determinants, the less healthy you're going to be, the earlier onset will be your diseases of middle age and old age, and the sooner you will die. And this includes the childhood adversity scores. We now know that if you all know about the ACEs study? Should I recap that? You know the ACEs study? Okay. So one of the things we now know is that if you have 6 or more ACEs, so exposures to adverse experiences under the age of 18, you enter a risk pool where you are, on average, people in this risk pool will die 20 years sooner than the people who were born the same year they were. Wrap your mind around that. We did a local study in Boston, and we discovered that the people who live in Beacon Hill, which is a very privileged area of Boston, live on average into their late 80s. People who live in the more disenfranchised neighborhoods of Boston, which are largely communities of color and high rate of immigration communities, they tend to die in their early 50s. That's not an individual decision. That is a group effect that is just really quite astonishing. What is even more astonishing is that these social determinants of health are also the social determinants of the likelihood that you will experience a persisting and disabling psychiatric disorder, depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder, even the triggering of a psychotic disorder if you have genetic vulnerabilities towards schizophrenia or bipolar disorder. And then we've mapped over these same, we meaning the scientific community, not me and my pal, but the science began to look at mapping the social determinants on crime rates. And lo and behold, and this isn't, you know this, you live in this world, these social determinants of health and well-being also are determinants of the likelihood that you will become entangled with the juvenile and or the adult criminal justice system. And if you do, the likelihood that you will come into that system at least once on a crime of violence against a person. So do I think that people make individual choices and they do so with some degree of what we will call free will? Yeah, I think that's right. I think it's possible that people can make good choices and bad choices because not everybody in a risk pool is going to manifest the risk. Most people who are poor, for example, are not criminals. There is a thing called, charting your course. However, the environments in which we have to chart our course are markedly different depending upon the constellation of social determinants you have to be thinking about. So for shorthand, we'll call this context, right? Environmental context. One of the challenges to thinking in this model, however, is that adolescents and young adults who have early, and especially if it's persisting contact with our systems, are not average. They tend to have greater exposures and impact of negative social determinants, including the ACEs. That has impact on neurodevelopment. It doesn't stop neurodevelopment, but it tends to slow it down because the brain, if you're in an environment where you're exposed to these social determinants, has to spend most of its time focused on surviving this hour, this day, this week. And your brain is ruthlessly efficient. It will pay attention to stuff that will help you survive. So we know that kids who live in dangerous communities where they're exposed to violence or violent households, one of the things that happens is that the hippocampus, the part of your brain that helps you learn because it takes experience into short-term memory and transposes it into long-term memory, it's not as important function. It goes to remembering the things that are really important to survive. So the sound of my parents' steps as they come up the stairs to the front door, and does it sound like my parent is drunk? Because experience teaches me that if I hear those shuffling steps, bad things are going to happen in the next few minutes. Hippocampus is trying to work in survival mode, right? Our brains are built to encounter bears, not live with bears. And so it's a little less cued into geometry the following morning. It also hypersensitizes the threat activation system. So you see them becoming more reactive. You actually see the amygdala, which is the part of the midbrain that is your fear circuitry. It is your threat detection circuitry. It is the circuitry that creates our sense of emotions and then assigns emotional valence to the experiences that we're having. In people with multiple exposures to the social determinants, their amygdala actually gets larger and becomes hyper-reactive. It can readjust itself. It only begins to readjust itself when basic physical and psychological conditions of safety are instituted. And so a key goal from a policy is to get young people who are in these kinds of environments into situations in which they can feel literally physically and psychologically safe. They tend to have less access to the youth development resources, higher prevalences of earlier onset substance abuse, greater risk of abuse and addiction. They have a higher risk of development mental health disorders that we were talking about before, with earlier onset, more persisting, more difficult to treat. So what does this tell us? Our brains mature from back to front. That's essentially replicating what happened in fetal and early infant development as the fetal brain and early infant brain develops. That means that the part that sort of engages physical maturation systems turns on, then the midbrain with the amygdala and the hippocampus, locus coeruleus and other parts of your brain come online. Last to come online are your frontal lobes, especially the prefrontal cortex. That is the part of your brain that allows for emotional regulation, anticipation of future consequences, impulse control, all these other sorts of things. And as when I was sort of getting into this corner of the world, one of my neuroscientist friends, who I really love a lot, but you know when adults are trying to explain a complicated concept to a 4-year-old and how we slow down, we get a little patronizing in our tone, and we try to explain to little Timmy why it's a mistake to put Kitty into the dryer and pretend you're in space. That's a bad idea, little Timmy. So she would say things to me like, Robert, you need to understand that it's perfectly normal for adolescents and early young adults to have a phase in which they have the midbrain of a Ferrari engine and the frontal lobe brakes of a Honda Fit. Doesn't mean they have no brakes. It just means that from neuro terms, it's relatively inefficient. It's back to front. Our brains work by overproducing. The day you were born, you've had more synapses than you do today. You've got more synapses now than you will at the time of your death. The way that it works is you're just kind of like rich with these connections, and then your experience helps you create circuits out of those. It prunes them back on a use it or lose it kind of model. Gray matter, which is your information processing, centers increasingly are interconnected by white matter. That's the neurons that will create these interconnections. And these information processing interconnections continue to mature into the mid-20s. So you can see just sort of graphic display of the trajectory of brain development as the bluer side, as you get older, are showing more and more of the brain parts speaking to each other due to this interconnection. And this is what we're looking for at the end of the day. This is an fMRI scan of lateral brain section of a 25-year-old who's healthy. You can see how complex. And this is from a brain perspective. This is like sketching with a broad paintbrush. The refinement is really quite extraordinary. You see improvements in self-control as your frontal lobes becomes more and more efficient. You see on that one with the scatter plot, you can see that there is significant individual variation in how rapidly and how efficiently this happens. Judgment, as we mentioned before, is the last to develop without continuing to move on. My friend Leah, when I was trying to ask her questions about brain development, when is it done? Oh, Robert, what you're asking me is, when is the muffin fully baked? I said, yes, I like that. Yes, when is the muffin fully baked? She said, well, it depends where you're measuring and how you're measuring it. But the frontal lobe continues to develop into the early 30s, but we think it's mostly baked, be a little spongy in the center of that muffin. It's mostly baked by the time you're about 23, 24, 25, 26, that individual variation. So this is what it looks like when you translate it into behavior. Impulsivity declines with age and maturation of the brain and social development. Sensation seeking declines with age. Now I want you to watch this one, because this is a cruel joke of evolution. Risk preference is highest in mid-adolescence. Craving, preferring novelty, stimulation, and that can be defined by the environment which they find themselves. What counts as novelty, stimulation, excitement, opportunities to be with my peers. But here's the trick. At the time when their risk preference is highest, their ability to actually perceive how the risk applies to themselves is at its lowest. If you ask mid-adolescents at about 16 or so, are you healthier or less healthy if you're smoking a packet of cigarettes? They look at you like you're a fool for asking. They say, of course you're less healthy if you're smoking a pack of cigarettes. Are you more or less likely to get an STD if you have unprotected sex or protected sex? Yes, you are a fool. Of course you're less likely to get an STD if you have protection when you're... So they cognitively know the answer, but their ability to apply it to themselves in their own circumstances is really quite poor. And this is one of the reasons why you see commercial exploitation of this. And by commercial exploitation, I mean not only corporate exploitation, but drug dealer exploitation, gang recruitment exploitation. Early in my career, I was astonished when I was working in the emergency rooms. It was during the peak of the juvenile homicide epidemic in Boston. We would have kids come in who had been shot, and they were stunned by two features of the reality in which they found themselves. First of all, they could get shot. Other people got shot. I shot at other people. I'm not going to get shot. The other thing that was astonishing to me even more was it hurts. Now, you wouldn't think you'd have to sit down and explain that, but if I'd asked him the day before, do you think it would hurt if you got shot? He would probably tell me, yes, I'm sure it hurts if you get shot. But in his real world, he's not going to get shot and it's not going to hurt. Yes. Sorry, can you speak up? I don't know.
And to explain that dynamic?
There is. It's actually a really interesting one, because what I'm describing to you is not just in human beings. It's in every mammalian species. This brain phenomenon, this trajectory. And so the short form on this is that most of human history, we lived in very small groupings. We were nomadic hunter-gatherers until about 4,000 years ago, when we figured out how to do organized agriculture. And hunter-gatherers have to live in social groupings that are typically no more than about 40 to 60 people, because they have to keep moving and they have to be able to survive on what they can hunt and gather, right? So you can't have a big population because you'll starve. Besides, they didn't have basements that you could live in until you were 40. So the thought was and oh, by the way, the average lifespan of a human being up until about 4,000 years ago was 22, 23 years old. If you lived till you were 30, you were ancient. So here we are, we're a primate, hominid group species, mostly moving rather than staying in place. And if too many of you stay around, you'll all starve. So doesn't it make sense to have a phase of human development where you are physically mature, strong, can reproduce, and have this inexplicable drive to find out what's on the other side of the mountain? Or what if we went this way instead? If you look at the spread of human population from out of East Africa and across the globe, we moved pretty quickly. And we moved from the Arctic to the tip of South America and Africa and into Australia. So the thought was it makes absolute evolutionary sense under those evolutionary circumstances. It's also true that those were they were tight, they were such small groups, everybody knew each other. There was all kinds of human contact. And you had to mutually support each other, or otherwise you were going to die. So if you look at small communities of that sort now, the idea that you would have a nuclear family where two parents raise children, that just seems absurd to them. All the adults have to raise all the children. It takes a village to raise a child. That's sort of a cute political slogan here, but that's a thing in these kinds of smaller indigenous communities that were all of our communities as a species until we organized agriculture and could stay in one place for a while. So that's the thinking about it. It also now becomes a challenge because there are so many of us living so closely together, and the young people, they're wired for stimulation, for novelty, for excitement. They're wired, and we'll see in a minute, I'll show you how your brain wires you for this. They're wired for cohesion with their peers and peer approval. But now, you know, in the olden days, if I had an infight with someone in my social grouping, the adults would shut it down. Because there weren't enough of us for you people to be punching each other in the nose or stabbing each other with a wooden spear. What I needed you to save your aggression for is when somebody else comes over the hill. So most of the violence was focused on a defined other. That's why the othering part is so fascinating to watch. So we watched all of us, I was there at the time, we watched the spread of the neighborhood gangs in Boston. And you know how they identified themselves back at the beginning when Boston was about to develop the highest juvenile homicide rate in the country? Which sports cap were you wearing? Block by block. Which would have been fine if what they did was like taunt each other. It would have probably been fine if they threw rocks at each other. It's not fine when they're shooting at each other with 9mm. So these are very, very familiar evolutionary processes, and you get a whole day on how our brains operate and the way in which our brains operate by creating distinctions, similarities, and differences. This is one of the reasons why, from this point of view, it's interesting to watch polarization, because what you do is you create fear, you create an enemy, and then you call them the other, and you blame them for your problems, and then that legitimizes attacking them. That's the way our brains are built, is to say, this is similar, this is different. This is similar, this is different. Which is fine if we're choosing between milk chocolate, white chocolate, and dark chocolate. Those are different, and yet they're the same. It gets dangerous when I wear a bull's cap and you wear a twin's cap. It's legitimate for me to shoot you. Now, we all have our sort of rules of engagement in our heads about whether and under what circumstances it's legitimate to use force. The law even has that. Future orientation, was that helpful? Yeah. Future orientation increases with age. They're more willing to delay gratification. They literally spend more time thinking before acting. The younger they are, the more likely they are to spend roughly the same amount of mental energy making a consequential or inconsequential decision. As they get older, they will literally spend more time thinking about consequential decisions, partly because they now recognize this decision is consequential. The decision this is a real case, a kid I worked with for a while, the decision when I get home, whether to turn on my Xbox first and then put my Hot Pocket in the microwave or the other way around, we think that's hysterical. That doesn't sound like a very consequential decision for us. And he spent time thinking about that. It was roughly the same amount of time as he spent thinking about the invitation from his 22-year-old cousin to go with him on an adventure on Friday and be the lookout for an armed robbery of a business. Didn't even recognize the consequentiality of it. You asked him if it was wrong, he would say, that's wrong. But to him, let me see if I can get to that there. But to him, the salience of having positive regard from his cousin, he's wired to very highly value that. So adolescents are wired, they will take more risky behaviors when they think when their friends are watching, or quite frankly, if they think their friends are not just present watching, but are remote watching, or will hear about it later. There's a part of your brain, adolescent brain, that literally lights up. It's right in the middle of dopamine-rich reward centers. It lights up in adolescence and early young adulthood. When they're alone, they don't engage in as risky behaviors. That part of their brain that is a reward stimulus for them doesn't light up. And you know what? That part of the brain stops lighting up when your friends are watching by the time you're about 25 or 26. It goes offline. It doesn't need it anymore. So what does this tell us? It helps us understand the impulsivity without considering long-term consequences. It shows why they may be prone to emotional and reward-driven decisions and poor decisions in high emotional contexts. We'll get back to that in a moment. Heightened sensitivity to social feedback, and especially peer feedback and acceptance. They have amplified responses to potential rewards. They are gradually developing better decision-making capacities, but they're going to make mistakes. Adolescence is sort of having to ride the bicycle while the bicycle is still being built. And they're going to make mistakes. I had a son that I will just briefly summarize as a young man, very intelligent, but not a pony brought easily to bridle. By the time he was 13 years old, I decided that my image of fatherhood was going to have to be substantially altered, because given my son and his love of his activity with his peers, his impulsivity, his willingness to be reckless, take risks, this is the young man who worked very hard and became a very, very good travel team soccer goalie. How many of you have kids that play soccer? Right. So I'm not telling you any secret when I say the kids that are goalies are crazy. They're just crazy. And they take risks. My son had 3 severe concussions by the time he was 18. Because he was the kid who go, yeah, I'll put my head between your boot and that ball. Sure, that seems like a good idea at the moment. So they're sort of I decided that my job was to keep him from catastrophe. And I did that because I had the resources to be able to do it. I palmed off a lot of his parenting to this travel soccer team, and 2 coaches disciplined him and guided him and mentored him and consequenced him. And I could afford to do that. And I could afford to drive him 2 hours to practices and 7 hours to games, I kid you not. If you took my same son with that same brain, I was a single working father working 2 or maybe 3 service industry jobs, so I wasn't home. And his bestest friends in the whole wide world were the 22-year-olds who lived on a block in a neighborhood where there was a lot of drug sales and gang activity. He would have been a very different kid. His brain isn't different. The context in which his brain is developing and learning is different. Now, I would have been at some service industry job, not around to know where he was, and to know what specific guidance I had to give him because, like many adolescents, he wouldn't tell me the full story of what's going on. He'd know I would tell him that's a bad idea. So, long-term consequential thinking is not their strength, or to empathize with the broader impact of their decisions. Now, all of this the Supreme Court knew at the time of Miller v. Alabama. There were still some puzzles. By age 16, most adolescents are about as good as most adults in capacities associated with being competent to stand trial. That's a little complicated, but that's a general rule, I think. Most are about as good as giving medical informed consent. This is probably too much information for you, but there's something in the disturbance of my personality when I've had sort of a choppy day. Nothing soothes me more than going home and reading Scalia dissents with a nice Cabernet. And one of Scalia's dissents, I think, was quite important. This was in a reproductive rights case. It was about whether or not adolescent girls had to tell their parents and get parental consent for abortions. And the APA, American Psychological Association, submitted an amicus science brief saying mid-adolescents are capable of offering meaningful medical informed consent. And Scalia, you could just hear his head catching on fire. You know when you put too much lighter fluid in the barbecue and you throw the match in and it goes, that was my sort of mental image reading Scalia's dissent. Because he basically wrote and said, what? So when a girl wants an abortion, they're capable of sitting calmly, contemplatively, they can make consequential decisions.
We're sorry to keep you waiting, but all of our staff are assisting other.
Yeah. We will. And yet, when you've got a kid coming in and they've committed a homicide, they are bundles of impulsivity and recklessness and incapable of consequential thought, and they're supposed to get a youth discount for murder? Like, which adolescent have we got in the courtroom? That was a brilliant question, and he was right. The answer is you get both in the courtroom. When children are acting as defendants, they're working with a reasonably competent attorney. They are often being spoken to on more than one occasion by an attorney, and they're sort of, the attorney ideal is acting almost like an external brain, explaining to them what the decision points are, what the options are, what we can do from here, how likely it is that's going to work. In medical informed consent, including, this is not just in the abortion context, but medical informed consent for things like agreeing to be in pediatric oncology clinical trials, risk benefits of going into experimental medicine. They're about as good as most adults, or as good as most adults. But how do they make that decision? They sit with their family, or even if they don't sit with their family, they sit with a nurse practitioner, they sit with their doctor, who sits and has a conversation with them. A very different decision-making context, right? And yet, it's right at that time when they're beginning to show capacities for goal-oriented, consequential decision-making, like the students who managed to get into college because they could sit down long enough to fill out applications and write their personal statements and all that sort of good stuff. That's when that risk-taking spike takes off. So why would that be? Well, one is they're getting older, so they are less intensively supervised by adult environments. Adolescents are more free-range chickens than 9-year-olds are. They're out in the world, they're out and about. And their brain for peer regard has taken off. So what we discovered is the importance of hot and cold decision-making context. So vulnerability to reckless, poor, flawed decision-making persists in adolescents and young adults past age 16, especially in hot cognition contexts. Hot cognition is when they're under stress, in the heat of the moment. There's a sense that you've got to make a decision now, and during a state of high emotional and physical arousal. So one of the things that we've learned is that when your heart rate goes above 180 beats per minute, your frontal lobe basically turns off. It's one of the reasons why people who are first responders, special forces, so forth, that's why you train and you train and you train and you train and you train, because if you are in these high intensity environments, you fall back on your training. Now, special forces a long time ago, the Navy SEALs started this, but now all the special forces do it. They realized the importance of this, and this is why they were early adopters as part of training special forces to teach them mindfulness exercises and to use biometrics so that they could put them at high stress environments and let them practice keeping their heart rate under 180 beats per minute while they are engaging in combat operations where if you make a mistake, you will die. You literally train them to keep their heart rates low so that their brains can work. It takes a while, but it does work. Cold cognition is the calm environment, time and tools to make well thought out decision, time to consider inputs, more logical and reasoned thinking. So they remain vulnerable to this kind of flawed decision making under conditions of hot cognition until they're in their early 20s. And then their brain matures to the point where the frontal lobe, prefrontal cortex, has matured, and you see this phenomenon begin to fade. They are more likely to control themselves, their emotions, their impulsivity, and so forth in hot cognition. But again, they have to practice it, and sometimes they will fail. And this will be sort of submitted for your approval. Exhibit A, 15 minutes of film of Spring Break, where you have mostly college freshmen and sophomores, many of whom are on Dean's List at their universities, making their way to Florida, where our culture sort of gives them a time to get a little wild, and some of the crazy things that they do. The number of arrests by the Fort Lauderdale police, the phenomenon of sort of group streaking after they discovered that tequila is not just for breakfast anymore, the number of them who come back from spring break unintentionally pregnant or with a sexually transmitted disease or with bruises because of the bar fights they've gotten into. And you know what? They were a complete dumpster fire in Fort Lauderdale for a week, but they're still going to be on Dean's List at the end of the semester. Same brains, different context. That's an almost hilarious example. It's less hilarious when I say two groups of kids who are with each other, watching each other, ginning each other up, maybe a little high, maybe a little intoxicated, wandering around the neighborhood, who suddenly encounter the rival gang with the wrong baseball cap. And some of them are armed. That makes for a less hilarious moment of hot cognition, thinking, and reactivity. So we'll make these PowerPoints, these we've already covered, so in the interest of time, I'm just going to move on a little bit. So I want to be thinking about what does this mean for some of the concepts that we have in the law. And one of them that matters a lot, as you know, in the criminal context is premeditation. Very often in legal contexts, rule seems to be you have premeditated if you can see there is a direct connection between cause and effect. Pulled the trigger, had acquired a target, you knew that discharging a bullet would be risky at best, lethal at worst, premeditated. That is a notion of premeditation that dates back to early English common law, although we also saw that in Roman law as well. That's where we are, about a 9th century understanding of what it means to make a decision. From a cognitive science perspective, that's a kind of premeditation, but not all premeditation resulting in action is of equal quality. That's one reason why when I would be doing informed consent evaluations, when I was working on an inpatient surgical unit for mentally ill persons at Mass General Hospital, they had to appreciate more about risks, benefits, and likely outcomes of the surgeries they were going to undergo, other than the doctor tells me that I need to have the tumor taken out or the tumor will get worse and I'll die. That all by itself is not adequate to be an informed consent. You understand the risk. You understand the consequences. You understand what will happen if you don't take the tumor out. Are there alternatives that you are aware of and that you've thought about? That is a fuller conversation other than repeating what the doctor told me or knowing that they need to have the tumor out or they'll get worse. So one of the things to be thinking about is if we know that there's kind of this skew in the way in which they process information, for example, the role that peer influence plays, the role that making decisions in high emotional context plays, and so forth, then there's a 9th century, almost monastic understanding of premeditation really capture the complexity of what we're trying to look at here. And the law has not really come to grips entirely with this. Weighing risks and benefits, identifying, considering options, foreseeable consequences, unintended and unintended consequences. So some of the science applications for this for transfer or sentencing, first of all, the criminal bright line at age 18 has no basis in science, really a cultural artifact. People will say, yes, we have to draw it somewhere, and we let them join the military at age 18, 17 if their parents will approve. We let them contract, we let them get married, we let them do these things, and the answer to that is absolutely true. But that's not the only line we have. So in most jurisdictions, for example, you can give consent to sexual activity before you are 18. My lifetime, the age of consent in Louisiana was 13. So we can let them make decisions about potential impregnation well before they're 18. I don't know what the age of consent is in Minnesota. It's 16 in Massachusetts. Shudder to think of the decisions that 16-year-olds make of this sort. And we won't let them buy a beer till they're 21 or legal cannabis. So yes, we draw the line where it suits our purpose. And so the question then is, what is our purpose in drawing the line here? And then treating categorically people above that line and below that line very differently one from the other. What I would argue is you can leave the line wherever you want. The question is, what do you do with the people who are on some side of that line or another? And all these systems are man-made. These are not sort of delivered to us from above on scrolls or inscribed in tablets. We know that that's not the case because other countries very similar to ours have decided to say, yes, the line is an important line. Real interesting question is, what do you do? What do you do on both sides of that line? And what are the purposes of that line? What goals are you trying to achieve? And I would go back to the very beginning of our conversation. The goal here is to achieve community safety, but also the longer term well-being of the person who has bruised our community so that they don't do it again. That's not what our system is designed to do at this point. Most offenses will be committed before the age clock kicks in. If you wanted to craft a system where you would draw into the net a large number of people who in a very short period of time are basically going to knock it off, and not because of threat of incarceration, you would draw the line. Age 18 is a good one because that's right in the middle of when the spike is going up and about 3 years before the spike's going to go back down. One of the reasons why the Germans stole our very good idea and sort of created this mid-zone between 18 and 25 or 26. Most, even chronic, even violent, younger offenders will desist from crime with maturation, especially if we don't do things that inadvertently are likely to prolong their criminal careers. If you were going to design a system where your goal was to prolong youthful criminal careers and make them amongst the 5% of people who will have juvenile court involvement, but who will continue to have persisting criminal careers well into their adulthood, one of the first things you would want to do is incarcerate them as early as possible with older criminal adults who have failed to read the social learning memo. Because this is really what this is all about. This is about learning the social memo and how the world really works and the kinds of decisions that can lead to consequences that are foreseeable if you slow down long enough to think it through. Then think about how that will impact you and other people. There are some things that will prolong criminal career of young people. The most potent one is mixing them in with older offenders, and especially if you take them out of their communities and put them into enclosed communities with older offenders. Another one is to not pay attention to substance use disorders or the impairments of psychiatric disorders that may compromise social learning. Another is to completely ignore the context, which may have been drivers of their crimes in the first place. It's really interesting to me that when you look at the juvenile data, I don't know of a young adult data, but I'll tell you what this looks like on the juvenile side up to age 18. 2 times when young people who encounter the juvenile system are most likely to commit suicide. That is the 1 to 3 days upon their admission into detention or an incarceration, juvenile incarceration facility. That's kind of intuitive, right? The 1 to 3 days before they're going to be discharged. Why? Because for many of them, the problem that in their community is a driver of their involvement or their behavior in the justice system in the first place remains an unsolved problem. Like you've put me in the detention, adults are watching, nobody's going to kill me in detention. I'm going back to my neighborhood where people are still waiting to shoot me. Going back to an unsolved problem, and nobody in the system has thought it was their job to sort of say, what are you going back to? Going back to resuming your substance use? Following with people who carry and use guns, being unhoused. So it's worth sort of thinking about what extent are we inadvertently compromising our own goals of community and individual safety? It's also the case that the heinousness of a youthful crime does not predict either recidivism or ultimate rehabilitation. The Supreme Court in Roper v. Simmons got it exactly right when it wrote in the opinion, the heinousness of a crime is not a reliable predictor of recidivism. There are so many other factors to be taken into account than the characteristics of the crime. In fact, one of the strangest things that has happened since Miller is that we've had large numbers of people who were, as juvenile offenders, sentenced to life without possibility of parole because of their involvement in a homicide all a youth, committed as a youth. Or to either by categorical mandatory, right? All persons convicted of this crime get life without possibility of parole. Some of them were discretionary. They were basically sort of deemed by policy or by sentencing judge as the worst of the worst, and that they would come back and they've crossed a line from which they can never return and all of this stuff. But we've known for years that persons who have been incarcerated for homicides, not the life without parole people because they never get out, but like the second degree people, they have a much lower recidivism rate than car thieves, drug dealers, and armed robbers. And rarely is it another homicide. Oh, I had it on my sheet as 10:30. My error. Thank you. So, my 5 minutes. In Roper, the Supreme Court correctly said that it is impossible, very difficult for even a trained psychologist to predict the ultimate outcome of rehabilitation for an adolescent. They could have gone one bridge further and gotten it right. It is not possible for a trained psychologist or anybody else to look at somebody at 16, 17, 18, 19, and be able to predict what the ultimate outcome will be. But at Miller, that's exactly what they told sentencing judges they had to do. They instructed them to do what is impossible to do and get it reliably right. I've already covered this other stuff, so I think I'll just sort of close out. How much punishment is enough is a moral and social decision that is not a scientific decision. And I certainly know people who will say, as was said to me by a father of a murder victim who was 16 at the time of his death, doctor, this is all really interesting, but I don't care if the person who killed my son is Mahatma Gandhi when he's 40. He needs to die in prison, and I hope when he does, he's not demented, because I want him to know where he is when he dies and why he's dying there. Fair enough. But let's not cloak this around with, talk about rehabilitative goals, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's a pure punishment, and we don't care about the rest of this stuff. General deterrence, we've already talked about. It's certainty, not duration, and conditions of confinement are important. Incapacitation may be necessary for a time, but it should be restorative rather than retributive, and we should do something with the time that we have them in our custody. And with that, and scene.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kinshirf. That was amazing. Now, I know some of you have to leave, but we did want time for questions. And so if you're able to stay, we are able to be in this space for a bit longer. So feel free to raise your hand. Dr. Kinshirf is still going to be here. And if you need to leave, that's also totally fine. Please join me again and thank you, Dr. Kinshirf. And please raise your hand if you have a question. I'll come around with the microphone.
A couple over here.
How you doing? Jabari Barner. My question was, I saw earlier in your slideshow, it seemed intentional, but I saw the word prevention / was it protection from?
Yes.
Yeah, so can you talk a little bit about why you didn't just use the word prevention?
Because sometimes that dog is off the porch. Sometimes that dog is off the porch. The prevention dog is off the porch. There's already criminality happening, so we have to figure out a way how to get the dog back on the porch. I'm a big fan of upstream beats downstream. And the reason why is because in an ideal world, we would be investing heavily in prevention, and there are strategies to do that. Those are mostly not prosecutorial, although there are some things prosecutors can do. Those are often bigger policy things. But I also just wanted to recognize that sometimes things happen, and then you have to figure out how to cabin that. Like, we try to prevent measles, but sometimes people get measles, so we need to be thinking about what a response would be. And I'm thinking the primary helpful response to communities once things are underway is to try and protect people from, in the measles metaphor, from getting the measles or from being severely impaired or killed by the measles. Yeah.
So I can easily understand how, as a prosecutor, we might prevent recidivism. I understand that concept. But how can we as prosecutors be generally preventative? It seems to me that as prosecutors in the criminal justice system, just by nature, it's a reactive system. So how can we be preventative in this role?
So I think part of it would be community engagement and what you are communicating to community about your role. Much of the communication in recent history has been on the reactive part. But prosecutors can also, prosecutors are very influential in their communities. They they can throw their weight for and against various kinds of public policies, various kinds of legal reforms and the like. I think of prosecutors as being roughly in the position of physicians who work in hospitals. There should be other people whose job is mostly a prevention work, but in a well-run hospital, when you come into the emergency room, they're all not only trying to figure out what brought you into the emergency room today. Now they will give you screens that have nothing to do with the fact that your leg is broken. Like, do you feel safe in your home? Some jurisdictions even say, are there firearms in your home? And if so, are they safely stored? Here's your depression and anxiety screening questionnaire. So they're doing prevention work while paying attention to broken leg. What I would think is if you have a young person who comes into your system, you may be paying attention to the broken leg, the infraction that brought them into the system. But you can also be asking about those other things that if we, broad we, people outside the prosecutor system, or in some cases you can bring it in-house, what do we do to make sure that this person is better situated over time, so we're less likely to see them back with the malady that brought them into the emergency room in the first place. So you can also take steps to keep young people from moving downstream. So in some places, prosecutors' offices are running diversion or participating in politically supporting police diversion, where police are diverting rather than arrest and arraign. But they don't oppose that, they support that. Some places, I'm working very closely with the Suffolk County, basically the city of Boston district attorney, in implementing an early adult program where we're taking young people who are coming in, and not all of them are first offenders. We're trying to give them a post-arraignment predisposition, pre-conviction predisposition way of getting off the traditional track. It's almost like a supportive mentoring / probation without you having to get a conviction first. And one of the reasons for that is because of the incredible collateral consequences of a felony conviction. At least in our jurisdiction, it obstructs educational opportunities, education, all that sort of stuff. So you're right, it's a reactive system, but even within reactive systems, there are measures that can be taken to kind of slow the drift into the system. Even simple things like detention decisions. Our data taught us that if we detain juveniles, and some do need to be detained, don't get me wrong, but sometimes our judges would detain a kid for 30 days or so because I need to get their attention. Right? What we learn when we track the outcomes is if we have a kid detained for 30 days, the odds that they will finish their current academic year without having to repeat is incredibly high. So we're asking a kid who's already struggling, who wants to be the 18-year-old who's still a sophomore? And they can quit at 16. So we had to work closely with our judicial colleagues to not use detention as a way to get a kid's attention because he wouldn't pull his pants up or he smirked. And that was a real thing. We had one judge in one of our courts who gave every kid who came in on anything that was other than a shoplift 30 days of detention, a status case. And we came back and said, you realize that most of the kids that you have detained like this, some of them you had to detain, they were serious charges, but the ones who were in those gray area cases were the lightweight ones. Most of them don't finish high school. Was that your goal? We can do business differently. Yes.
I think mine's probably pretty quick. So I guess I'm just wondering where the stimulation piece, like you could obviously see there was a super high spike in the 90s and then again in like the 2010s. And I can't help think, but social media and with the rise in the 90s, that peak of media, everyone had a TV in their house starting in the 70s, 80s, and then just kind of gradually kept growing. So I guess just that crossover piece with social media, what's your opinion?
My opinion is that there are certainly things that have happened that could not have happened the way that they did in the absence of social media. So the almost instant national spread of Kia Boys. We had things like that happen in the past, but they were rollouts. It took a long time for the fad to make it, from wherever it started to wherever it ended up. And now you can get these contagion effects really, really quickly. So I think that contributed, is attributable. I've seen some places where, thankfully, it did not spread past those places, but where armed conflict between young people was spurred first by the use of cell phones and then by the use of social media. So I think this is a new era of technology that we've got to be very thoughtful about. What I would also say is, pandemic, we already had cell phones and social media in place, and we never, in some places, in the west side of Chicago, for example, in Baltimore, you saw these huge spikes in young adult homicides. But we didn't see what we saw in the 80s, which was you could look at the 15 largest US cities, and they were all fighting these gun spikes. We got bragging rights in Boston because we get up earlier in the morning. We're it's 30 New Englanders. We need to get out and do our business. It was horrifying. So even with the social media, it's not a gimme that all of these will move beyond contagions. One thing I will add, because I do think this is a thing. I don't know how it works here, but we had regional detention centers that earlier, we didn't detain as much until the spike. What we found was that when we started putting kids from different communities in the same detention facilities, they simply exchanged cell phone numbers. So what used to be gangs that were confined to 1 or 2 blocks suddenly became multi-city organizations. Thankfully, we don't have a whole lot of multi-generational, Crips, Bloods. We do have some MS-13. So your point is well taken. It's something that we have to be really thinking about communication strategy to reach our communities, because ultimately it's not going to be the police responses or prosecutors' responses that are going to keep these from being contagions. Those are going to be community responses in the same way as community responses that stop suicide contagion. Get her question, then we'll get to you, sir.
So I'm going to let Tracy ask her question. I also want to tell our folks online that I am aware that there are questions on the Teams chat, and we will ask those in a moment.
Thank you for coming. I'm a public defender, and I was kindly invited to attend today, and I practice solely in juvenile court here. I find myself getting in arguments with probation. I may have a client who's seen a sibling or a parent murdered, and I might be arguing for trauma-based therapy. And I'll have a probation officer saying that, nope, they need community service. And ultimately we'll decide that a kid will be more served by doing community service for a random nonprofit than receiving government subsidized trauma therapy. And I believe that's because our system doesn't even have a way of talking about protective factors. We don't have it built into our laws. We don't have that term even used in our courthouse. I'm wondering if you have seen across the country or in your travels in the world how juvenile justice systems implement protective factors as part of the dialogue related to sentencing or disposition related to children.
That's a great question. Yes, I've seen it. It requires time and culture change. It also requires the key players to agree that this is a lens that they want to use in order to understand and respond to young people. I would say the places where it's increasingly baked into the system include Washington, Oregon, Massachusetts, Colorado. Texas is mostly a county-based system until you get to more serious crimes. So I would say you might take a page out of the playbook of San Antonio, Houston. This is not a red-blue kind of thing. When they have taken these decisions because they decided they wanted the twin results, community safety and individual well-being. The individual well-being over the longer haul. So Utah's not bad, actually. If you go to the German system, they've been doing what we would think of as using a trauma lens since 1950. One of the reasons for that was the number of young people who had survived strategic bombing, Russian invasion, Allied invasion. They had seen horrible things. And so the Germans figured out pretty early on that if you just wanted to go pick up trash along a highway, that wasn't going to do it.
I'm going to let Sean ask his question, and then I'll ask the online question.
Thank you. I was just going back to your slide regarding that one of the key important part for juveniles is that a response is the consistent response is the key. It's not necessarily length of response.
I'm sorry, going a little fast for my old ears.
Sorry about that. Noting that you said the key for juveniles is that consistency in response is what's important, not length or severity of a response. Are you aware of any data or implications of using an indeterminate sentencing system as opposed to a determinate sentencing system? For here, we've got adults that use, they have their set incarceration number as opposed to, well, it depends on how you do, how you perform. Have you seen any studies that has a difference?
Seen any with juvenile or young adults? What I have seen is that in those systems where an indeterminate structure has been in place for adults, it incentivizes adults to basically have fewer problems with institutional adjustment because they have some motivation to lower the time that they will spend incarcerated. That being said, that outcome also tends to be mediated by what the resources are for education and vocational training. If you're just going to ask people to, sit and do time, you'll just do less of it if you sit quietly. That doesn't seem to have the impact on recidivism. And you can do an indeterminate sentence, but wouldn't it be great as part of your showing your preparation to go back to your community that you got your high school equivalency and held a job in the prison?
Our online question is, what considerations or support should be made for young people with mental illness who are at risk for substance use or crime due to social determinants, since there is a correlation between mental illness impairing cognitive brain development and maturation?
I'm not sure what is meant by accommodations, but I guess if I understand the question correctly, the first thing to do is to recognize that part of what is going on here is a driver or an impairment of social learning. It is a reflection of the impairments of the illness. The second step is to figure out where to get evidence-based treatment for the mental illness with which they are presenting. And then the third is to say there are some kids where if you treat the depression, especially in young men, one of the symptoms of depression is often an uncharacteristic marked irritability and explosive anger. They get into fights at school, they get into fights with their parents. You treat the depression, they go back to their baseline, and they stop getting into trouble because the irritability that was reflected in the depression was what you were dealing with. Sometimes it's a little more complicated and systems have a hard time with this because clinicians aren't trained to sort of think about this, which is sometimes you have a mental illness, but you also have criminogenic attitudes, values, and beliefs. So when I treat your depression, what I have is a sharper, more focused, happier individual who still thinks it's okay to break into your house. Right? So you not only have to address the impairment in social learning, but you also have to directly address things like the peer group, the family circumstances, the attitudes, values, and beliefs. There is a deferred sentencing program in Rhode Island federal court where, to their credit, they didn't cherry pick. These are people who are there on serious gun and drug charges for the most part. They're almost all young men of color between 18 and 25. Many of them have post-traumatic stress disorder, diagnosable. It's really clear this isn't faking. This isn't like, victim weeping. They really have PTSD because of things that have happened to them and that they've witnessed. They also have high levels of depression. If they all go for a mental health evaluation, if there's a treatment plan indicated, they get a treatment plan. Whether you have a psychiatric illness or not, all of them are referred to a modality of intervention called MRT. This is an evidence-based intervention to address criminogenic patterns of attitudes, values, and beliefs. So I think of it as getting the twofer. You both deal with the reactivity that comes with their PTSD, so that they can stay more contained, less likely to be reactive, but they also need to complete the MRT course. The MRT course is set up in modules, and in order to not be brought back and resentenced, and sentenced, they haven't been sentenced yet, you have to complete it. And you complete it by showing that you have not only, filled out your workbook, but you're actually demonstrating changes in your thinking patterns and your behavior in your real life. So I would say that if you have somebody who has a significant mental illness, you need to still be accountable. I don't like my symptoms made me do it any more than I drank too much and the Budweiser made me do it. But I do think it's really important to identify, treat, and parallel treat the criminogenic attitudes, values, and beliefs.
Well, thank you again, Dr. Kinshirf. I'm sure there's more questions, but Dr. Kinshirf has kindly said we can both share his PowerPoint slides. We have recorded this, and he has made himself available to us to